Hi there, and thanks for joining me for Across the Board 2, my second look at a favourite board game. This one is somewhat unusual in that there's not much of a board, there's no counters, figures don't really play much of a part, though it is suggested that you use figures. There's not an awful lot of dice rolling. In fact, it seems in some ways there's not a lot going on at all, and yet it is a very interesting game. So, the game is called Becket, and this of course is named after Thomas Becket, who was the Lord Chancellor and later became Archbishop of Canterbury, until his career and life were cut short when he was assassinated by two knights after Henry II famously said, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" Now, I'm going to stop there with the history because I sort of get confused between what I learned at school and the first series of Blackadder, which, I don't know, may have been just as accurate as what I learned at school, certainly a lot more entertaining. But that's the setup of the game. We're in the medieval age, everyone has a position from the king down, and everyone is trying to climb their way by fair means or foul up the ladder to the top. So here we are, Becket, medieval power game, written by John Withers, published by Mrs. J.M. Withers. And I think I mentioned before, I do like how in the old days, people just used to put their address on stuff, so you could write to them and ask them questions and that sort of thing. That's very nice, I think. Now, it's a stapled booklet, so this was from 1978, and really there's only about sort of, I think, 7 or 8 pages in here of rules, so not a lot of rules. And the introduction explains the idea which gave rise to Becket germinated a couple of years ago at a meeting of the Chase Militaria Society, when a then popular player interaction game turned out to be disappointing because players could progress by doing their own thing rather than interacting. So it says that Becket was designed from the outset as a game where player interaction was not merely desirable but quite essential. And it can take any number of players from 6, it can be played with less, but the flavour tends to get lost, up to 22. And it is also timeless. You can play it for an evening, a week or a year. The necessities of play are 22 model figures, you can use counters if you prefer, a percentage dice, pens and paper. And then thanks go to my fellow CMS members. I wonder if the Chase Military Society is still around, who helped me develop and play test these rules. Some other war games rules by John Withers there. Yasta, 3-dimensional First World War aerial combat, and Star Strike, 2 or 3-dimensional ship-to-ship combat in deep space. I wonder if anyone's got a copy of those lying around still. So before we get onto the rules, as this is about board games, let's look at the board. And this is basically it. So an A4 sheet, and what we have here is Ye City map, and it gives you the location of all the characters in the game. So we've got the king front and centre, and then we've got officers of the Treasury, Controller of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chief Collector of Taxes, Lord High Marshal, Lord Steward of Kings, Lord Privy Seal, Lord Chancellor, etc, etc, etc. So this is what you would put your figures on during the game, and we'll get into how the figures move around that board in a moment. But as you can see, very simple, very basic. So the aim of the game is quite simple: to become king, and then having gained the throne to keep it. Easier said than done. And we have this very strict structure with the throne at the top of the pyramid. And let's just take a look at that. So these numbers refer to the houses or the buildings on the board or on the map. We start from level 1 with all basically servants of or officers of the army. We get into level 2 offices, the Lord Privy Seal, Lord Chancellor, or so on. Lord 3, the Lord Steward of the King's Household, Lord High Marshal, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then finally to the King, or presumably Queen as well. So that is the aim of the game. and each player operates one figure, is one character. If there are less players than offices, then the remaining offices are filled by dummy figures. I think they're sort of controlled by a dice roll to see what they might do. Each player has a dice roll to determine his figure's strength and another to determine their starting fortune. So there's just two characteristics for each player. The figures are put out and then we get into our sequence of play. So a turn represents a day and consists of the following 7 phases: financial phase, denouncement and intercession phase, movement, combat, wound recovery, parliament and promotion. In the financial phase, players draw their salary appropriate to their office, and here we get, so if you're level 1 you get 50 crowns and the king gets 500 for a day. So already there's quite a large disparity in income there. You do have the option, particularly if you're the collector of taxes or the controller of the treasury, to dip your hand in the purse and can purloin up to 100 crowns extra daily out of the funds, or even more if you're Chancellor of the Exchequer. However, such actions are felonies. We'll get onto that later. Now, you do have a little shopping list here of things you can buy: leather armour, mail armour, full plate armour, shield, dagger, sword. It kind of gives you an idea of where this is going, right? And if you're involved in the army, or if you're the army commander, you do get half price. You get a nice little discount on those items. And players are totally free to trade items or anything between themselves as well. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting, because if you're the Lord Privy Seal, Lord Steward or Lord Chancellor, you have the right of denunciations. So if you think that one of those characters has been dipping into the funds in that particular phase, you can denounce them. If the player is found to have committed a felony, they are summarily executed unless there is a successful intercession made by the Lord High Marshal. So obviously it pays to have the Lord High Marshal on your side. However, if the denunciation is unjustified, so if the person wasn't fiddling the books, the denouncing player must immediately pay to the denounced player a sum of crowns equal to their daily salary. So basically, if you say someone was fiddling and they get executed unless there's an intercession. If they weren't fiddling, then you have to pay them. And of course it's up to the Lord High Marshal whether they intercede or not. If the Lord High Marshal is a dummy office, then that's done on a dice roll, as we mentioned before. So that's the first couple of phases over. Then we get into our movement. Each player writes down in secret whether their figure is to remain in its position, their starting point on the map, their appointed office, or if they're going to move to another location. Those are all revealed at the same time. Now, if that means that we have a numbered location with more than one figure in it, we have a potential source of combat. Of course, the figures don't have to fight, but of course they might want to, or one might want to anyway. So if you've got two players in the same room, basically, anyone can declare an attack on anyone else in there. And then we get combat is resolved depending on if people have got swords, daggers, armour, all that sort of stuff we were looking at before. And if the strike is successful, then we throw another dice to get the number of wound points. Of course, when your strength falls to 0, your wound points come off your strength. When that falls to 0, you're dead and out of the game. So, pretty straightforward, basic combat. So this is another place where your intrigue comes into it, because you might have 3 or 4 figures in one room. The example they give here is 4 figures, and one says he's going to attack the other, I think thinking that the other pair are going to help him, but the other pair decide they're not going to help him, they're just going to stand back and watch. Following the combat we get a wound recovery phase. All surviving figures are now returned to their own locations, killed figures being removed. And you get to recover wounds. Again, you roll a dice to see how many strength points you get back. Now, if the throne is vacant at any time, you go into the Parliament phase. If the throne is vacant and more than one level 3 officer has survived, a Parliament is summoned. All surviving players decide by majority vote which of the eligible candidates will ascend to the vacancy. And remember, from our chart, that's just those level 3. So there's only one of these 3 can become the ruler. If you're down here and there's no king or queen, you can't jump. You have to be in one of these positions. So you see now how you have to work your way up the greasy pole, so to speak. Now, because you've got people moving up or people dying, moving sideways, moving up, whatever, then we get into the promotion phase. So if there's any vacant offices, they are now filled, and it gives us the sequence for that. We've already mentioned if the throne is vacant, then level 3 will move up into that, which in turn will leave a vacancy in level 3, so etc, etc. So that's just the mechanics of how promotions then work. And this is where further intrigue goes on, because of course promotion is always assisted by you know, a little bag of gold coins, perhaps, that kind of thing. So this is where a person now can start getting their allies, or their allies for the moment, into those other positions. So that's basically it. Then the figures are repositioned. That's the end of the day, that's the end of the turn. So then you go on to the next turn. So those are the rules, basically. As I say, there's barely, what, sort of 7 pages of rules there. Pretty simple once you get into it, pretty straightforward. But the strategy, or interest if you like, comes from those interactions between all these different offices, between the officer of the city garrison and the Lord Steward of the King's household and so on. So I imagine you're going to need some time during that for people to go away and have a little chat. I'm not sure if you have to be in the same room as the other person to talk to them. That's not made particularly clear, but I would probably add that in, because then everyone gets an idea of who is talking to who. Plus, if someone comes to visit you in your office, are they coming for a chat, or are they coming to try and stab you? That adds a nice little bit of uncertainty, doesn't it? So as I said at the start, quite unusual for a board game. It's almost more like an RPG, though. This came out in '78, so quite early for an RPG as well. And I think if I was going to play this anywhere, I'd make a larger board, perhaps even just a basic layout with all those buildings on, or something representing each of the buildings, just to give it more of a visual focal point. And then it's a question of how do you manage. I mean, can you imagine if you got 15, 18, 20 odd players? That's quite a lot to manage. You'd have to have a very clear marker for the intervals, perhaps ring a bell or something to denote each stage of the game. But we did play this a couple of times back in the day, though I think maybe with just half a dozen of us, and I do remember it as being very enjoyable, especially if you like a bit of skullduggery and backstabbery. I don't know if this is still available anywhere at all, and I've never seen it anywhere else. I can't even remember where I bought it, where I got it from. It was probably from one of the game shops at the time, or maybe at some sort of event, and it just caught my eye. I like that sort of intrigue type game. Anyway, that's it for today. If you have got a copy of this, or you have played it, or maybe there's even an updated version somewhere, do let me know. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on it. And if you fancy playing it, then do let me know. We need to get together maybe a dozen people or so, and probably spend most of the time quoting Blackadder lines at each other. But you know, that's all in the spirit of the thing. So, thanks very much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.